Edible wild plants are like friends that wait for you wherever you go. From a young age, I've been taught a couple of the wild edible plants that were around me. For the most part, this just consisted of some berries. Well, once I became older, I got a couple books on the subject, and since then, my knowledge and curiosity on it has just continued to grow. I now know and can recognize many different types of edible wild plants. Now, you might ask, why does this matter to you? Well, living in Minnesota, there are many different places and situations where we could find ourselves in a survival situation. If it is useful to know what plants are edible around you in case you find yourself in a situation like this. And even if you never do, your effort will still not have been in vain. Many edible wild plants are very tasty, and you can find them just on your average camping trip or walk. I believe that people should learn to forage because it not only provides them with cheap, healthy food, but is also a valuable skill to know in case of a survival situation. So today I'm going to give you some reasons why you should learn about edible wild plants, some steps you can take to learn about them, and some questions or concerns you may and I'm going to answer some questions or concerns you may have about them. So first off, let's start with some reasons. Wild food is everywhere, and few people even know about it. I've seen this happen several times. One example of this would be when my brother went camping with a friend of his. He found what he said was the biggest serviceberry tree he had ever seen. He started eating from it, and he got his friend to do the same. Well, they returned back to their campsite with faces and hands all stained bluish purple in containers of the berries. Well, his friend's mother panicked because she didn't know that those berries were edible. She thought that her son and his friend had just got finished eating some poisonous berry. He said it took lots of convincing before he assured her that they really weren't going to die and that it wasn't poisonous. This brings up two important points. One, that many people nowadays are very skeptical and amazed that anything growing wild can actually be edible. Another thing it brings up is how many people nowadays don't even know what is around them. This tree was in the middle of a public campground. I'm sure several people saw it every day, and apparently none of them knew that the berries were edible. Now, you might say that it doesn't matter. People are just safer going to the grocery store and getting their food. Well, as the Minnesota Hunter Education Youth Firearm and Safety Guide says, you can go 3 weeks without food, 3 days without water, 3 minutes without oxygen, but only 3 seconds before you begin to panic if you find yourself lost. If you find yourself lost, why are you going to panic? Well, I think at least that it's mostly because you probably have nothing familiar around you, nothing prepared for the event, and you're beginning to wonder if you're going to survive. Imagine the comfort that would bring you if you started to panic but saw all the edible wild food that was around you. In a matter of seconds, you've just obtained something familiar, some provisions, and something to keep your mind off of being lost at the second. Everyone can be affected by learning about the wild plants that are around them. First, it is healthy and cheap. It costs only the time it takes to pick them and learn about them, and really, it's not even that much time either. They're fairly easy to learn, and many plants are very widespread and common. It is very healthy, too. As Samuel Thayer says in his book, The Forager's Harvest, although most wild plants have not been nutritionally analyzed, the ones that have been often contain far more nutrients than domestic food. For example, Robinson, in a New York Times article in 2013, says that dandelion contains 7 times the phytonutrients as spinach, and most people would consider that spinach is one of the healthiest foods you can get. I also believe foraging to be pretty environmentally friendly. First, it brings you closer to nature. In the strange but true words of Connie Green, co-author of a book on forage food, she says, not only can you look at the beauty of the world, but you can actually ingest it. A second benefit would be that many of the people that are trying to get rid of the weeds that grow in their gardens and lawns, the weeds are really quite edible. A couple examples of this are purslane, goosefoot, plantain, and dandelion. I believe that if people knew that these plants were edible, they probably wouldn't try so hard to kill them, or at least they'd be able to get some use out of them. Alright, so now that you know some reasons why you should learn about forage food, I will give you some steps you can take to learn about it. Learning about it doesn't need to be hard. Sometimes you can find classes that are offered on it. This is especially true in the southern half of Minnesota. Unfortunately, as we're in the northern half, learning from people that we know might be a better resource. Most of us probably know at least one or two people that have a limited knowledge about it, whether it just be a couple of types of berries or maybe some nuts. But if you don't know anybody that knows about it, you can always learn how I did, which is through books. Even though I only have 3 books on the subject, they offer a wide variety of edible plants, and you can really learn a lot from them. Sometimes the information can be a little misleading, so it is good to verify it, but mostly the information that isn't quite accurate always errs on the side of safety rather than vice versa. Books are a valuable tool, but in case you don't feel like purchasing some or checking some out, you can always check on the internet. Some people will say that the internet's never a good idea, but I've never really had a problem with it. I follow what Samuel Thayer says. He says, if it tastes bad, don't eat it. Your taste buds are given to you for a reason. He even calls supposing foraged food to taste bad an insult to foraged food. So that being said, if you did find something on the internet and you tried it and it didn't taste good, well, don't eat any of it. If it doesn't taste good, why would you want to anyway? Alright, so now that I've listed some steps you can take to learn about foraged food, I'll address some questions or concerns that a lot of people have about it. To start off with, many people are afraid they'll get poisoned if they eat anything that doesn't come from a grocery store, restaurant, or garden. Thayer asserts that the only reason people have ever died or gotten sick from wild food is because they've misidentified the plant. Also, some people might be worried that edible wild plants are polluted. And while I can't really deny this, I also have to agree with Thayer that we live in a rather polluted world, unless most of the food from our grocery store does have chemicals on it already. And unless it's like 100% organic, you already eat food that has chemicals on it. If you are worried about your wild food being contaminated, you can always go further into nature where things are probably going to be less likely to be polluted. Another worry people might have are that 2 plants are so similar that you won't be able to tell which one's poisonous, which one's edible. Well, as Thayer puts it, there is no such thing as a look-alike, only look-similars. If people couldn't tell the plants apart, they wouldn't be considered separate species. And although it might take a little practice to learn the difference, it is possible, and the enjoyment you gain from being able to eat food that you yourself picked can't be topped. Some people might also worry that wild plants aren't that common. This is just the opposite, though. On top of me just being able to assert this and give examples of it, Thayer also brings up the point that for most of human history, people have lived off of foraging and hunting. If the plants weren't all that common, we probably wouldn't have survived. Bradford Angier, in his book Field Guide to Edible Wild Plants, also brings up the point that wild edible plants were very important to Native Americans. He even goes so far as to suggest that Native Americans were healthier than Europeans when they arrived because they had more wild plants in their diet. Some people might also worry that edible plants don't taste that good. And while they do sometimes have some unique flavors, that doesn't mean that they're necessarily bad. Parrish, in an article in Pittsburgh Post-Gazette in 2014, says that wild edible plants, flowers, and fruits offer tastes and textures that money can't buy. No one talks about this if they don't think that the food's good. Some people might wonder if you could actually survive off of wild plants. And the answer is yes, you could. But I wouldn't think that you would ever be able to grow fat on it. Justin Ashton says in the West Briton, a newspaper from England, that carbohydrates are difficult to find in quantity in foraged food. For us living in Minnesota, this is especially true. However, roots still can supply us with some carbohydrates. Thayer also supports that you can live off of just wild food by saying that one could subsist on nothing but food obtained from the wild. So in other words, yes, if you did find yourself lost, you could survive off of it. Alright, so today I've talked about some reasons to learn about wild edible plants, some steps you can take to learn about them, and I've addressed some questions or concerns people often have about it. Imagine if you took my advice and learned about the edible wild plants that are around you. You might be able to be like me or some of the other people who on a walk near Leicester River around Anger tower were able to pick raspberries and blueberries and service berries and thimbleberries and to be able to enjoy them. But now, what if you find yourself in the woods and lost? What would you do? How would you react? While survival situations do not occur every day, if you ever did find yourself in a situation like that, wouldn't it be a lot more comforting to know which plants are edible and not? Learning how to forage really is rewarding, and you don't have to learn a lot to be able to enjoy it. I hope that you will take some time out this summer to learn about some of the wild edible plants that nature has to offer you. Then, whenever you go outdoors, you can see all of your wild food friends.